Dr. Paul Saladino, you and I, we've changed our minds on a bunch of things over the last couple of years, but I want to highlight maybe the 5 biggest things that you've changed your mind on in the last 5-6 years. So, without further ado, let's just jump right in, man.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm a vegan now, so that's just, everybody can just lose their mind about that.
Special link down below for 20% off of these suckers, macadamia nuts from House of Macadamia, but it's not just 20% off. There's also a free box of Namibian sea salt macadamia nuts. That's literally a free entire box with whatever your purchase is. So the cool thing about House of Macadamia is specifically their bars. So their bars, the first ingredient is macadamia nuts. I challenge you, if you go to like any grocery store, look at the macadamia nut bars and it might have macadamia nuts somewhere in the ingredient list, but these are legit. The first ingredient, we're talking like 45% macadamia nuts. We're talking keto friendly, low carb, also vegan if that's what you're into. The whole thing is amazing and they're harvested in South Africa. The proceeds benefit the farmers. The farmers have ownership in the company. They're taking the world by storm. That's why you're seeing them on Joe Rogan. That's why you're seeing them on Tim Ferriss. They're everywhere. But that special link down below is a 20% off discount link exclusively for people that watch my video. So it's a special link and a special offer. So you got to use that link and then you add the macadamia nuts to your cart and they will get taken off when you check out. So that's how it works, just to make sure you can take advantage of the offer. So check that link out down below in the description.
No, I'm joking. So obviously still love meat and organs, but I think the biggest thing for me that I've changed my mind on since I wrote the book in 2019 was carbohydrates, and then in connecting with that, the ketosis and ketogenic diets. So when I wrote the Carnivore Code, and this is humbling, this is what we all do, is we write books and then you put your thoughts into cement, you freeze your thoughts in kryptonite, and then you change your thoughts and you think, oh, the book, it's just not a living document. But when I wrote the book, I was of the opinion that carbohydrates were not great for humans and was sort of looking at the literature differently. And over time, I learned personally in my own life, doing a carnivore diet of meat, organs, and fat and salt for 1.5 years, that including carbohydrates in my diet improved my health from there. So my whole story is that I was eating kind of a paleo diet, had really bad eczema, which I'd had my whole life. Getting rid of vegetables and all plant food significantly improved the eczema, so much so that in the last 4.5-5 years since I've been on this more specific path, I haven't had any flares of the eczema that are significant at all. That's a big deal because I had massive eczema on my elbows, my wrists, my hips, so much so that I really couldn't even wear pants easily. It would get on my shirts. I couldn't do jujitsu because I had eczema on my knees and it was getting infected. So getting rid of vegetables really helped with my eczema. But then I learned after 1.5 years that I was getting such bad muscle cramps, heart palpitations, sleep disturbances. My testosterone was kind of going down. Right now it's around 700 or 800. I've included carbohydrates in my diet for the last 2.5 years. But at that point it was going 450, 500, it was significantly lower. And my sex hormone binding globulin was creeping up. So I had electrolyte issues. And what I realized was that I'd been thinking about insulin wrong. I'd been thinking that I needed to keep my insulin low all of the time. And to be fair, on a carnivore diet, my fasting insulin was low, 3.5, 3.0. And I thought incorrectly that if I ate carbohydrates, my insulin would spike and that would be a bad thing, right? What I realized, and I wasn't taught this in medical school, was that insulin spikes after you eat carbohydrates are actually healthy for the human body for a variety of reasons. So insulin is probably something else I've changed my mind on, carbohydrates and insulin. What I realize now is that your body needs an insulin signal after a meal when you eat carbohydrates to signal to the kidneys to resorb and hold on to minerals, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. So the massive, profound electrolyte problems that people get on long-term ketogenic diets are almost certainly due to a lack of insulin signaling at the level of the kidney. There are various levels of kidney physiology upon which insulin is going to act, but people in the ketogenic space, I think, are well-intentioned and they're trying to hold on to minerals by including massive amounts of salt in their diet, but it just doesn't work because you need an insulin signal at the level of the kidney to hold on to those things. So the first thing I did when I sort of transitioned off a ketogenic zero carb, quote unquote, carnivore diet was include honey in my diet. And the first couple of days I felt a little weird because I was physiologically insulin resistant. And then your body kind of adjusts to this, my blood sugar spikes normalize. And if I eat honey today or a few years ago after I had adjusted to having the carbohydrates back in my diet, my blood sugar might go 130, 140, 150 milligrams per deciliter. But I don't worry about that because if you look at the actual shape of that curve, it comes back down to a baseline very quickly, within the hour for sure. So this is normal human physiology and we should not fear glucose spikes in a metabolically healthy individual. It's going to go up, it's going to come back down. That's normal. And that insulin signaling is healthy for humans at so many levels. It's healthy for our hormones, it's healthy for our brains, it's healthy for the production of glutathione and the resorption of minerals. So that idea of insulin being all bad all the time and including carbohydrates in my diet, that was a huge, huge thing. And now we know, I mean, there's tons of research that I just didn't see at that point, that I was sort of blind to, about carbohydrates for athletes, carbohydrates post-exercise. I mean, we just worked out. I have holes in my shorts now from the weight belt, and this, this weight that I was using has ripped a hole in the front of my shorts here. And carbohydrates post-exercise are so clearly shown to improve performance. Carbohydrates overall are shown to improve all sorts of metrics in humans: testosterone, recovery, sleep, all kinds of things. So those are two big ones for me from the outset.
Now, on the cramping side, I've got a question. As far as, because I've experienced that when I'm low carb, right? I'm very, very prone to cramping, which, as someone that does a lot of endurance stuff, it's problematic. Like if I'm backcountry or anything like that, I was just doing a long trek and ran into a huge cramping issue, even though I'm not super low carb anymore. I guess I'd still lowish carb. And I would argue that it actually takes time to actually like recover from some of that insulin issue that you have with the kidneys. But the question that I've always had, and maybe you know the answer, since protein is insulinogenic, can you get some resorption of the minerals through the insulin spike with protein, or does the glucagon cancel that out in that case?
I mean, you get some, it's just nowhere near. If you look at the amount of insulin and the level of insulin you get with carbohydrates, it's much higher than it is with just protein. I mean, you get some with protein, it's just not the same as a carbohydrate spike. And so people in communities that are fearful of carbohydrates will say, look at how much insulin you're getting. And that's good, you need that. And so people understand this also, like when you don't eat carbohydrates, you become insulin resistant. This is not the pathological insulin resistance of diabetes, which is different physiology that I can describe. This is the insulin resistance of physiology, basically historically, evolutionarily, this is starvation insulin resistance, meaning that you are physiologically insulin resistant. Your body is saying, hey, spare the glucose. Any glucose you're getting, spare that for the brain, the adrenals, and the gonads, and maybe the red blood cells. Don't put it in the muscles. That's physiologic insulin resistance, and that's what you see in people who are low carb or zero carb or keto, and that's why the first time someone like that eats carbohydrates, they may feel very strange, or the blood sugar may go up. This is why a woman who is low carb will fail a glucola test in her pregnancy, because that is physiologic insulin resistance. And I actually have come to believe that's not a good thing. I don't think we want to be physiologically insulin resistant. It is a historically, evolutionarily adaptive thing for extreme situations, but I think that humans do better, and I've come to see carbohydrates as a signal of abundance. I mean, if you go to spend time with the Hadza or the Maasai or the Samburu or the Khoisan, I mean, these tribes invariably seek carbohydrates and they celebrate it. They don't think, oh, I've had 100 carbs today already, I'm not gonna eat this. When I was with the Hadza, we found a beehive and they just went off on this thing. I mean, I got a big chunk of beehive and ate it with the larva in there and the honey, and it's amazing. And the three Hadza guys that I was with were probably ate 60, 70% of the honey in this hive, and then shared a little bit with their comrades when they came back. Say, hey, we found a hive, here's a small amount for you guys, but they'd eaten a ton of this stuff. So historically, I think humans had massive exposure to carbohydrates whenever they could get it, as much as they could get it.
Yeah.
They didn't fear it at all.
I would agree. I mean, I definitely feel like, to say that carbohydrates aren't evolutionarily correct is invalid. I think there's always access to them at some point, one way or another. So
humans are seeking them. Yeah. If we don't have them, we're seeking them. If we can't find them in berries, I didn't mean to cut you off, but if we can't find them in berries, if we can't find them in honey, we're going to find them in roots. Yeah. It's a piece, it's interesting. It's just so intuitive and simple. We're looking for animal protein, we're looking for nutrients and organs, that's clear, we're always eating the whole animal. But the next thing, I think in tandem with that, we're also seeking carbohydrates as wild humans. We've forgotten what wild humans look like because we all, except for maybe a couple thousand people on the planet today, live as semi-domesticated humans. But it's very clear. I mean, if you look at the Hadza, so there was a PhD researcher who actually spent a lot of time with them and gave them surveys of these nomadic tribes and said, what are your favorite foods? And there were 5 foods that were their favorite. So there was meat, there were berries, there was baobab, there was tubers, and I forget the last one, I'll think of it in a moment. But honey was invariably the first thing that they wanted. Both men and women ranked honey as number 1. And men said meat as number 2. Women ranked berries, baobab, and tubers, I think all about the same. But in both groups, the roots were sort of the last thing that they wanted to eat.
Wow, man, that's wild.
But both of them really, that was the favorite thing for them, was honey.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. It's delicious.
They celebrated it more than anything, right? And if you look at these people, there are tons of studies of them, of their cardiovascular health. They have insulin sensitivity, which is amazing, which is exemplary. They're not insulin resistant. They're not diabetic. They're not obese. So
my own anecdotal experience, I don't eat an abundance of carbohydrates, but I've added honey and fruit in, and my insulin sensitivity has improved on my lab work. So, I mean, it's...
By fasting insulin, which is perhaps the most clear metric you could ever use. That's unquestionably an improvement in insulin sensitivity. All
right, so we've got 1 and 2. What would you say the third thing that you've...
Fasting, probably, which is linked. So the literature around fasting and around sort of autophagy is not as clear as I once thought it was. It's kind of murky. And I'm just not convinced, number one, that you need to fast to have autophagy. If you look at markers of autophagy, our body is always kind of doing this. Our body is always using ubiquitinization of proteins and recycling them. And there's some evidence that you're doing just as much autophagy when you're eating as when you're not. And there are some things that can trigger autophagy or autophagy signals that you're eating, like glucose or trehalose, which is a sugar that occurs in plant foods. Like that apparently triggers autophagy. That's including something in your diet. So eating glucose triggers autophagy. This is not the traditional, canonical narrative we hear. So to make it this simple narrative, like you must fast to do house cleaning, that sounds very appealing to people. And they're thinking, yes, I just have to fast more and more. I want a clean house. I go home into my house. I'm reading like Marie Kondo. I have to put everything in its place. I want a very clean house. Marie Kondo, like the life-changing magic of tidying up. So that's what they think about their body when they're fasting. And it's just not that way at all. And there's some evidence that potentially fasting could induce negative cardiac remodeling or lead to fatty infiltration in cardiac tissue. So it's just, fasting is not as benign as people believe it to be, in my opinion, and people get super freaking triggered when we're talking about this. So I know the comments are gonna be out of control, but I don't fast anymore. And I don't think that it should be taken as a completely benign intervention. I mean, it was all the rage 4 or 5 years ago. And I was doing carnivore, I was doing intermittent fasting. And I just think that's not how I think about it today. I think that there's benefit to giving your body signals of abundance. And we can talk about cancer more if you want or wherever, but I think that there's interesting evidence that sometimes doing too much autophagy is almost leading you toward cancerous pathways. And
it's too much of it's a constant give and take. I like the way that Mark Sisson actually put it. He was like, I don't even like the word fasting. He's like, I like fractal eating. He's like, I go through periods where sometimes I don't eat, but it's not like I'm consciously thinking about it. And I've come to think that like the body should be flexible enough to handle periods of time without food, but it doesn't need to be this deliberate thing all the time. It's like Mark Sisson, it was interesting. He's just like, sometimes I just don't feel like eating lunch. It's fine. I don't want to eat, but I feel like I have a level of adaptation that allows me to do that. And it made a lot of sense with me. And, personally, the reasons that I will still train fasted in the morning is I feel good fasted in the morning, but I also work out first thing in the morning, and it also just feels weird sometimes. But to your point, if I'm going to eat something when I work out, it's going to be something like watermelon or honey or something that's just like quick absorbing, really quick. I've sort of come, I would say, full circle in accepting that fasting is not the end all be all by any means. But I do think that for some people, it's psychologically just how it works for them. Like if they can put themselves in a box and not eat during that period of time, if that's what works for them, and that's what worked for me when I lost a lot of weight. And I recently did a video kind of talking like why I don't fast so much anymore myself. And I was just thinking, okay, I'm down at the body fat percentage I want to be at. Is it anal retentive for me to say like, okay, I need to fast X amount of time?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so it's, right? So but I also enjoy how I feel certain times. So I just don't keep a logbook of when I fast anymore. It's just like, it's just gonna happen when it happens.
I've recently learned about some metrics on the blood work that I think can be very revealing for people. And I think there's a lot of research on this cortisol to DHES ratio. And it's not a fasted cortisol to DHES. It can be like multiple times a day you can look at it. But there's pretty good evidence that ratio can tell us, it correlates very strongly with longevity and morbidity. And so this is really powerful. So I think that if people are curious about this, I think that one of the problems with Western medicine is it's kind of like 35 years of an anachronism. Like we're just thinking about things like the literature suggested 35 years ago. We're not really up to date. And Western medicine I think of as like the Titanic. It moves very slowly. But I think everyone when they go to the doctor should be getting a fasting insulin, and we should all be getting cortisol to DHES every single time you go to the doctor, probably fasted and in the afternoon, and comparing those and sort of tracking those. So the one metric that I started tracking a few years ago is fasting insulin, and that's been really valuable just to be like, I'm on carnivore, strict carnivore, just meat and organs, my fasting insulin is low. I add carbohydrates, my fasting insulin is low. I add more carbohydrates to 200 or 300 grams a day from fruit and honey, something that a lot of people would say is pure sugar, quote unquote. And again, my fasting insulin remains low, sometimes lower than it was on carnivore. So I think we should all also be looking at cortisol to DHES ratio and just using this as a metric if we trust or we believe that the science is robust. And I think it's pretty solid with this ratio and saying, hey, I'm gonna go do some workouts fasted this week. I'm gonna get a cortisol to DHES ratio. Or if you're keto and you really believe it, get a cortisol to DHEAS ratio and then add carbohydrates and see how it changes. Because on one side is the cortisol, right? This is a stress hormone. And I think that there's a lot of validity to thinking about cortisol as an aging hormone. There are actually papers published, review papers asking the question, is cortisol an aging hormone? And I think the literature there and the evidence is pretty robust that it is. And you don't want your cortisol to be chronically, tonically high in general. And I think if you look at people on keto, they're gonna have higher levels of cortisol. I mean, there is this moment in the morning when you get this cortisol awakening response. And yes, that is a physiologic diurnal thing that happens. But other than that, you do not want your cortisol to be high. And I think what we see in humans is between meals, if you're fasting, your cortisol starts creeping up. And that to me is a signal. Maybe it's time to, if you have access to them, eat some carbohydrates to keep it down. We live in a stressful world. Driving, you get traffic, you have family things. Why are we putting more stress into our bodies? I think that at some level, it's very hard to make an argument for any hormetic. The whole idea of hormesis, I think, is philosophically flawed in many ways, but it's really hard to make a philosophical argument around the benefits of cortisol for hormesis in humans. I mean, it's clearly, there are such strong arguments now that it's aging, that it's pro-diabetic, that it's pro-liver fat. You want to keep this down, and I think that it's very cut and dry just to get cortisol to DHEAS and do interventions in your life and see what changes it, and you want to minimize that. You want that ratio to be as low as possible, less than 0.3 perhaps. And because you want your androgens, this DHEAS is a androgen precursor in the human body. You want your sort of sex hormones for both men and women, these androgens for both men and women to be high, and you want your cortisol to be low. And that's pretty cut and dry. It's like black and white.
No, that does
something to watch,
Makes a lot of sense. And that's something that anyone can go get an easy test on. That's a pretty inexpensive test too if you were to just go a la carte too.
As is fasting insulin, $25, $30 cash. I want to start like a nonprofit and just make fasting insulin free for people or make it accessible because I think it would change the landscape.
I do agree on that. Definitely agree on that.
Yeah.
All right, so we got 3 now. All right, what's number 4?
He's pushing me. So we got carbohydrates, insulin, fasting. I think I would probably say grounding, which is a little bit different.
Interesting. Yeah.
I used to kind of think grounding was woo and didn't really give much thought to it. And now I think about it every day. And I've really only just begun to look at the literature, and I'm sort of medical, biochemical minded. I need to kind of dust off the physics and the electrical engineering side of it. And so, but it is interesting to think about the way that our bodies are different when we're grounded, which is kind of connected to the earth, and when they're not. And there's not a ton of literature here, but the literature is interesting and it's compelling that, right now, actually this is funny, we have, I was showing you these shoes that a company sent me that have a grounding plug in them. And they sent me this thing called a continuity meter. And you can take this continuity meter and stick it in a ground. You can either stick it in the grounding part of an outlet. People don't do this at home. Don't electrocute yourselves. But if you know what you're doing, that little round plug in an outlet, that's the ground. So you can stick the continuity meter in a ground, and you can stick it in the actual ground, and then you can hold the continuity meter and it'll tell you if you're grounded or not. So I've been experimenting with this. It's kind of fun. Like right now, we're not grounded,
Yeah.
But if I go over here and put my foot on the concrete, this is probably grounded right here. And there's evidence that the way my body sort of perceives the environment when I'm here grounded versus not is different, which is really interesting. And there's something called the zeta potential on your red blood cells, this sort of charge around them. And there's research that looks at the way the red blood cells are charged when you're grounded versus not. And it's different. And you think, wow, that's actually physiologically different. And I mean, it's very clear. You can see this. Like if I have the grounding meter, you can tell like there's a difference in the ground. When you're not grounded, you're sort of accumulating a charge. And you think, is that something that your body is used to? Historically, evolutionarily, which is the framework that I consistently come back to, we would never have done this. It's very hard not to be grounded in nature 50,000 years ago. And I think, oh man, that was sort of a realization to me. Like, do you have a dog?
Yeah.
Always grounded when they're outside. Unless they're wearing like the doggy paw, like the doggy shoes, right? They're always grounded. They're always touching the ground. And we did this experiment at the Airbnb in Topanga. One of my guys actually climbed a tree, right? And so when you're grounded in a tree, when you're touching the tree, because the tree is grounded.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's very hard not to be grounded in nature without shoes on or with natural fibers in the bottom of your shoe. But it's very easy not to be grounded in our world today. And I thought, wow, that's a really stark contrast. You know, we have rubber-soled shoes, and how many people are actually grounded at all? And it's very possible that most of us are grounded 0% of the day.
Yeah, well, they used to say that when you would go to the beach, we used to be like, oh, it's the negative ions from the ocean that make you feel good. And I'd always kind of question that. I'm like, how about maybe this is the one time that people are actually taking their shoes off?
Or going in the ocean,
like,
which is incredible grounding.
Measure cortisol levels. They would like look at, just level, even perceived relaxation at the ocean. And they will say, well, like, oh, it's just the white noise or it's the negative ions. And I always question that because I've always speculated on grounding. Right. I've always been a fan and thought that it made sense because we are electrical systems. Like, it just makes logical sense to me, even without looking at literature. And so I had always questioned that and been like, not many people wear shoes on the beach. And I always thought that. I was like, maybe it's just the fact that they're actually connected to the earth in conjunction with these other things. Yeah.
And if going in the ocean, you're grounded. I mean, the sand is grounded without a doubt. But yeah, you think about it, like, it feels strange to be wearing shoes on the beach.
Yeah.
Almost anyone is when I see people walking in shoes on the beach, I think, don't you, like, there's some intuition, like, no, my body wants to touch that. Yeah. It's like seeing a glass of water. You want to drink that.
Yeah.
So your body like wants to do it. And I think that for most of us, when we are aware of this, if you see a nice patch of grass, you might actually want to like take your shoes off and go over there and like touch it, potentially because of this. I think and there is interesting research that it sort of calms us as humans and changes the sympathetic nervous tone. There are small studies in women who have done shift work, nurses, and they had them sleep on grounding mats for a month, and it normalized their sort of diurnal cortisol spike in the morning. Many people have this tired but wired physiology where they have this cortisol rhythm, which is out of sync. We want that to be early in the morning. That's what wakes us up. And sleeping on a grounding mat normalized it for these women. It's actually a very striking visual that maybe we can put in the YouTube. I can send you the study where if you look at it prior at the beginning of the study, it's just one study. I think it's 12 women. Their cortisol rhythms are all over the place. It looks like spaghetti or something. And then at the end of the study, they're pretty synced up. It's just this gradual decline throughout the day of cortisol and then a morning spike. Mm-hmm. And the intervention was sleeping on a grounding mat. And a grounding mat is interesting because it's this conductive surface. I think it's some sort of carbon surface. It's like, carbon type of conductive surface.
Amethyst and other things. Yeah.
Well, and it's plugged into a wall and it's plugged into a ground. You have to test the outlet. And, you can get very...
2.7, I think is what it is. 2.7 hertz. I don't know.
I don't even know. You can get very geeky about this, and some people are worried about dirty electricity and other stuff. But I think that any grounding is better than no grounding. And like that, basically you plug it into an outlet that's grounded, you test the outlet, and then you're grounded when you're sleeping. That's interesting. So I've been thinking about grounding more recently, and it's it just makes me even more like a hippie. I mean, I walk around in like cotton shorts with holes in them, and I never wear shoes anymore. So that's another thing I think about.
Definitely on the same page. I mean, I've been on the grounding kick for like the last couple of months, and I got a grounding mat, and again, purely anecdotal, right? But like even like my sleep, I'm just trying to like spend, even if I spend like 20, 25 minutes a day doing some kind of nidra yoga or meditating on it, just making a concerted effort. And of course I do try to be shoeless as much as possible anyway, but making a concerted effort with that. And I've even told my team, I've told JR, I've just said like, I know this is like hippie woo-woo witch doctor weird stuff, but like call me crazy, but I feel a difference.
Don't you? Yeah. I mean, I haven't done any controlled studies, but whenever I have friends over to my house, I'll put a grounding mat down on the couch or a bed and say, go lie on that and tell me what you feel. And I should do some sort of controlled experiment where one of them is plugged in and one of them isn't, and see if they notice a difference, they can tell. But people consistently, and again, this is nothing scientific, it's just anecdotal, it kind of feels like it's pulling you in, or like just like kind of grounded. It just feels grounded in an interesting way. So yeah, I think that's pretty fascinating.
All right, what's big number 5 here?
Okay, so I think number 5, it overlaps a lot with the other ones. We got shoes, we got maybe sunglasses. Yeah, changed my mind on sunglasses for sure. I don't wear them anymore. I think that you want the sunlight in your eyes. And I don't know. I mean, I think that there are times when it's super bright out. I just wear a hat rather than sunglasses because I don't want to confuse the brain. Like, this is so interesting that your eyes are, I've heard many people say this, but your eyes are sort of this exterior brain. These are outgrowths of your brain, and they're looking at the natural world. And so, yes, right now we're sitting under blue lights, not super evolutionarily consistent, but why would I want to walk around all day with some sort of UV filter on my eyes that kind of confuses my circadian rhythm? That doesn't make sense to me. Like, why would we do that? Yes, if you want to shade your eyes from something, I put a shade up here. And in Costa Rica where I live, I will wear a hat to protect my face from the sun. I don't use sunscreen unless I'm surfing. And when I'm surfing, I use a tallow-based sunscreen with zinc, with essentially no other active ingredients, because I'm really interested in sunscreens these days. but I just put that on my face when I'm surfing. I don't put sunscreen on my body. I do have some Italian heritage, so I tend to tan. It looks like you do too. Yeah. And so I will put a hat on if I'm walking around, but I don't wear sunglasses because I want sort of the full spectrum of light coming into my eyes throughout the day. I want that information. I think that for so many of us as humans today, a lot of health and disease is connected with the fact that we're giving our bodies very confusing information. Yeah. There's very confusing information around food, right? We're just not eating the same food anymore. And whether that's processed foods or seed oils, so many evolutionarily inconsistent signals to humans. How could our bodies be healthy, right? We're not grounding. We're not using circadian rhythms. We're not getting up with the sun or going to bed at night when it's dark. We're using blue lights at night. We're wearing sunglasses. We're putting things on our skin to protect, quote unquote, our skin from the sun when our skin is actually supposed to see the sun. And those things we put on the skin have octobenzone, avobenzone, octocrylenes, which are absorbed and connected with cancers. And so think about it, like we as humans in 2023 are basically, quote unquote, swimming in information that is confusing for our body. I mean, why would our bodies respond any differently than they are as a culture which is massively confused, massively unhealthy, and we have very unhappy people? So I think that the simple, and perhaps it's such an overly simplified concept, is just freaking give your body like basic natural information, quote, nature-based information, the natural state. Like, what is it? It's look at the sun when you wake up without contacts, try to avoid toxins in the environment like plastics that are xenoestrogens, put your freaking feet on the earth, don't wear synthetic clothing. That would probably be another thing I've changed my mind about, is underwear and what my underwear is made out of. Polyester underwear doesn't look so good for any either men or women. We can talk about Lululemon.
I don't wear underwear.
I don't wear underwear very often either, man. It's good I have a little bit of underwear on right now. I mean, I'm wearing some boxers because I got some holes in the front of my shorts here. But yeah, so I think that's true. But what are your shorts made out of?
Yeah, polyester,
bro. It would be better if you were wearing underwear.
It's just not comfortable.
So, I mean, and then I think it goes back to what I usually talk about, which is food, and the idea that look, your body needs to have a food signal. You just need to give your body the right information. And if you give your body the right information, and you being like a generalized royal you to all of the listeners, if we are giving our body the right information, then our genetics know what to do, and they're responding properly. And we're just, yes, humans might evolve into some transhumanistic cyborg in 1,000 years, but right now in 2023, we basically look like we did 20,000 years ago. And 20,000 years ago, we were giving our bodies very different information. I'm not saying we need to walk around in loincloths. The idea is that, hey, we live in an amazing time. We have technologies that make it easy to do things. I drove 40 minutes to get here from Topanga, and that would have taken me a whole day to hike here. Yeah. We still could have had a campfire tonight, but now we can do this technologically, and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people can see it. That's amazing. But as we're doing this, as we're using this technology, I think we need to be aware that we're giving our body different information than it's used to, and we need to return to what it's expecting if we hope to be fully healthy.
Yeah, it's a flat out crisis of abundance.
All right. Yeah. And confusion in terms of information.
Yeah. No, that's awesome, man. And I will say one thing on the sunglasses. I'm with you on the sunglasses. I did go snowblind one time.
Oh my God, well, all right.
Which I was hiking, climbing Mount Whitney. And so I was at like probably 13-ish thousand feet or so. And I was like, I'm not wearing sunglasses in this time.
It's extreme, right?
And I come back down and I'm sitting down, and we're having dinner afterwards. And I'm sitting down, and my wife says, Tommy, your eyes are bleeding. I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, you look like Terminator. I'm like, what's going on? And I'm like, I have blood in my eyes. And then I start sweating like I have sandpaper in my eyes, right? And end up completely blind, couldn't see, and ended up in Lone Pine Hospital, which is like a rinky-dink, really scary hospital just in the Eastern Sierras. And they had to give me these drops that they basically said, if you use these basically more than twice in a 10-year period, you will go permanently blind, because it's like the only way to get the eyesight back. I don't even know what the hell is in them, but it was just like, give me anything at this point to get my eye, it was. So now, anytime I'm going in the snow for longer than 2 hours, I'll wear sunglasses, but other than that, no.
Yeah, extreme circumstances, and I've done that too. I mean, I've climbed, the last time I climbed significant things was Whitney, or actually it was Rainier during my residency, and I did, you definitely wear sunglasses if you're on a freaking white snowfield and the snow is blaring down. But listen,
most people aren't.
0.001% of people on this podcast are listening to that, are doing that, and most people are just wearing their sunglasses. I mean, when I talk to women, they say, I'm wearing sunglasses because I don't want to get wrinkle lines in my eyes from squinting. Okay, great, wear a hat.
Hide emotion, which is a whole different question, right?
Yes.
That's a whole different thing. Like communicating, if you're wearing sunglasses, I know there's some early literature coming out surrounding even Botox and how it's affecting how people are communicating, which is really interesting, because if you look at someone that's had work done, the feedback, the loop is just, that signal is completely distorted, because there's this body language and this facial language that we would have if I'm talking like you and we're communicating, but if you're frozen, but it's the same kind of thing. If you're wearing sunglasses, I'm trying to communicate with you. I'm a big believer in that. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought the same thing with Botox. And it's, you meet people in real life, and especially here in Los Angeles, every once in a while I'm talking to someone and I think like, what is going on? Like, why am I not getting the right emotion? There are so many muscles in the face.
Yeah.
I don't remember how many muscles, but the complexity of human facial expressions is incredible. And to mute part of that is to take away some of our communication as humans. And I understand that women or men don't want to look older, but I mean, some women don't even want to laugh because they don't want to get wrinkle lines from laughing. And I think that's just ludicrous. But I agree. I think Botox changes the way that we're communicating as humans, and sunglasses too. You can't understand someone's emotions properly, just like masks did. And there's so many kids now that have perhaps stunted development from growing up, not seeing facial expressions when they were young during the whole travesty that we just went through. So who knows?
No, I'm with you, man.
Yeah.
Well, where can everyone find you, bud?
Paul Saladino MD on Instagram, and then that's pretty much the best place. On all the socials, it's Paul Saladino MD.
Well, as always, brother, thank you, man.
Thank you, man.